The screams echoing through the ancient Roman Forum weren't just the sounds of commerce or political debate. They were the agonized cries of the condemned, victims of a justice system so brutally creative that it would make modern horror films seem tame by comparison. When we think of Roman punishments today, we might picture a quick sword thrust, or perhaps the infamous gladiatorial combat we've seen dramatized in countless movies. But the reality was infinitely more sinister, more calculated, and more horrifying than anything Hollywood has dared to show us. The Roman Empire didn't become the dominant force of the ancient world through mercy or compassion. It carved its legacy across 3 continents using fear as its primary weapon. And that fear was most effectively wielded through public displays of punishment so shocking that they would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. These weren't just executions. They were theatrical productions of suffering designed to break the human spirit and send unmistakable messages about the price of defying Roman authority. What we're about to explore together will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient justice. The Romans approached punishment with the same methodical precision they applied to engineering aqueducts or constructing roads. Every scream was calculated. Every drop of blood served a purpose. Every moment of agony was choreographed to achieve maximum psychological impact on both the victim and the thousands who watched. Today we're going to strip away the sanitized versions of Roman history you learned in school and examine the unflinching reality of what it meant to face Roman justice. From the crucifixion techniques that prolonged suffering for days to the arena, spectacles where humans became entertainment, we'll discover how the Romans transformed punishment into an art form of cruelty that would influence methods of execution for centuries to come. The genius of Roman punishment lay not just in its brutality, but in its public nature. These weren't hidden executions carried out in dark dungeons. They were massive public events that drew crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. Citizens would pack amphitheaters and public squares, bringing their families to witness what happened to those who dared challenge the might of Rome. Children would watch alongside their parents as human beings were torn apart by wild animals or slowly tortured to death on wooden crosses. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the Romans elevated this carnage to the level of entertainment. What began as simple deterrent punishments evolved into elaborate theatrical productions complete with costumes, sets, and storylines. Condemned criminals weren't just executed. They were forced to play roles in mythological reenactments, where their actual deaths became the climactic moments of dramatic performances. The scale of this systematic cruelty is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. We're talking about an empire that, at its peak, controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population and used these horrific punishment methods as standard operating procedure for maintaining order. The Romans didn't just punish criminals. They created a culture where witnessing extreme human suffering became a normal part of civic life. Let's begin with the method of execution that has become synonymous with Roman justice, though its origins actually predate the empire by centuries. Crucifixion wasn't invented by the Romans, but they perfected it into something far more horrible than its earlier practitioners had ever imagined. The Persians, Seleucids, and Carthaginians had all used variations of attaching condemned criminals to wooden structures, but the Romans transformed this basic concept into a science of prolonged agony. The process began long before the victim ever saw the cross that would become their final resting place. Roman law specified that certain classes of people were more likely to face this particular death: slaves, foreign rebels, pirates, and disgraced soldiers found themselves prime candidates for crucifixion, while Roman citizens were generally spared this fate in favor of quicker methods of execution. This distinction wasn't mercy. It was a calculated reminder of the social hierarchy that kept Roman society functioning. The condemned would first endure scourging, a preliminary torture that served multiple purposes. The whips used for this beating weren't simple leather straps. They were equipped with pieces of metal, bone, or stone, designed to tear flesh from the body with each stroke. The victim would be stripped naked and tied to a post while professional executioners methodically destroyed their back, shoulders, and legs. This wasn't random violence. It was carefully controlled brutality designed to weaken the victim without killing them outright. The psychological torture began immediately after the scourging ended. The condemned would be forced to carry the instrument of their own death through the streets of the city. Contrary to popular depictions, they likely didn't carry the entire cross, but rather the horizontal crossbeam that would soon support their dying body. This beam could weigh anywhere from 70 to 100 pounds, and the victim would have to drag it through crowded streets, while citizens jeered and threw refuse at their bleeding form. The route to the execution site was deliberately planned to maximize public exposure. The procession would wind through the busiest sections of the city, ensuring that as many people as possible witnessed the fate awaiting those who challenged Roman authority. Guards would clear the way while also preventing any rescue attempts, though few would dare risk their own lives for a condemned criminal. Upon reaching the execution ground, the real horror would begin. Roman executioners had developed numerous techniques for attaching victims to their crosses, and they seemed to take perverse pleasure in varying their methods. Some victims had their arms draped over the crossbeam and secured with ropes that would slowly cut off circulation. Others had thick iron nails driven through their wrists, a process that would shatter bones and sever nerves while somehow avoiding the major arteries that would cause rapid death. The positioning of the victim's body was crucial to prolonging their suffering. If placed too high, death would come relatively quickly from asphyxiation. Too low, and the victim might find ways to support their weight and delay the inevitable. Roman executioners learned through experience exactly how to position each body to ensure maximum suffering duration. Some victims would survive for mere hours, while others would hang in agony for days before finally succumbing. The cross itself became a stage for the final act of this gruesome theatre. A placard would be attached above the victim's head, detailing their name and crimes for all to see. This wasn't just identification, it was a final humiliation and a clear message to spectators about what specific actions had led to this fate. The victim would hang there, naked and bleeding, serving as a living billboard for Roman justice. But the physical agony was only part of the torture. The condemned would be forced to endure the psychological torment of knowing that their death would be slow, painful, and utterly public. They would hang there as crowds gathered to mock them, as children pointed and stared, as their own bodily functions failed them in front of hundreds of witnesses. Every breath became a struggle that required pushing up on their pierced feet or pulling on their secured arms, each movement causing excruciating pain. The Roman system was designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. Victims would often cry out for mercy, beg for water, or plead for a quick death. These desperate pleas only served to entertain the crowds and reinforce the message that defying Rome led to complete and utter destruction. The executioners had the power to end the suffering quickly by breaking the victim's legs, but they would only do so when ordered by officials or when they needed to clear the execution site for other purposes. Death would finally come through a combination of factors that medical experts still debate today. Dehydration, blood loss, shock, and ultimately asphyxiation would claim the victim as their body could no longer maintain the struggle to breathe. But even death didn't end the display. Bodies would often be left hanging on their crosses until they decomposed, serving as rotting reminders of Roman power for weeks or even months. The efficiency of this system was terrifying. Multiple crosses could be erected simultaneously, creating forests of dying humanity that stretched along major roads leading into Roman cities. The most infamous example occurred in 71 BC, when 6,000 survivors of Spartacus's slave rebellion were crucified along the Appian Way, creating a corridor of crosses that stretched for over 100 miles between Capua and Rome. This macabre highway of human suffering served as the ultimate deterrent, visible to every traveler entering the eternal city. Imagine approaching Rome as a merchant or diplomat, only to be greeted by thousands of rotting corpses still hanging from their crosses, the stench of death permeating the air for miles. This wasn't accidental placement. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, designed to crush any thoughts of rebellion before they could even form. But crucifixion was just one instrument in Rome's orchestra of agony. When the empire wanted to combine punishment with entertainment, they turned to a method that would satisfy the bloodthirsty appetites of their citizens while disposing of unwanted criminals. The arena became Rome's theatre of death, where condemned prisoners would face something far worse than a quick execution. They would become the main attraction in a spectacle that blurred the lines between justice and entertainment. Damnatio ad bestias represented the Roman genius for turning necessity into spectacle. The empire had thousands of criminals to execute and hundreds of thousands of citizens hungry for entertainment. Why not solve both problems simultaneously? The condemned would be dragged into massive amphitheaters where roaring crowds awaited the ultimate blood sport. This wasn't gladiatorial combat where skilled fighters had a chance of survival. This was systematic slaughter disguised as public entertainment. The variety of beasts used in these executions reads like a catalogue of the ancient world's most dangerous predators. Lions imported from the African provinces would tear apart helpless prisoners, while crowds cheered from the safety of the stands bears captured in the forests of Germania would maul victims who had been chained to posts, unable to flee or defend themselves. Crocodiles from the Nile would snap their massive jaws around screaming prisoners who had been thrown into flooded arena floors. But the Romans weren't content with simple animal attacks. They elevated these executions into elaborate theatrical productions that would make modern horror directors seem unimaginative. By comparison, condemned criminals would be forced to play specific roles in mythological stories, with their actual deaths serving as the climactic moments of these twisted performances. A prisoner might be dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician, only to be torn apart by bears when his supposed magical music failed to tame them. These productions required enormous logistical coordination that revealed the truly systematic nature of Roman cruelty. Sets had to be constructed within the arena, complete with painted backdrops and mechanical devices. Costumes had to be prepared for the condemned, often elaborate garments that would soon be soaked in blood. Scripts had to be written and rehearsed, though only the survivors knew their lines. The condemned were simply expected to die convincingly when their moment arrived. The animals themselves became unwilling actors in these productions, and the Romans developed sophisticated techniques for ensuring their participation. Professional beast handlers called bestiarii would prepare the creatures for their performances through a combination of starvation and training. Lions would be deprived of food for days before an execution, making them desperate enough to attack humans, despite their natural reluctance. Bears would be provoked and enraged before being released into the arena, ensuring they would immediately assault whatever target was provided. Sometimes the spectacle required even more elaborate preparation. Elephants would be trained to trample condemned prisoners in specific patterns, creating a choreographed dance of death that amazed spectators. Bulls would be fitted with mechanical devices that would gore victims in predetermined ways. Even smaller animals played their roles in this theatre of cruelty. Venomous snakes would be released to bite chained prisoners, creating slow, agonizing deaths that could last for hours while crowds watched the victims writhe in poison-induced agony. The scale of these animal executions defied modern comprehension. During a single day of games, hundreds of condemned criminals might face death by beast. The inaugural games of the Colosseum reportedly lasted 100 days and consumed over 5,000 animals in various forms of deadly entertainment. Multiply this by hundreds of amphitheaters across the empire, operating for centuries, and the numbers become staggering. But perhaps most disturbing was how ordinary citizens reacted to these spectacles. Families would attend together, bringing food and drink as if they were watching athletic competitions, rather than systematic murder. Children would cheer as humans were torn apart before their eyes. Vendors would sell snacks and souvenirs commemorating particularly memorable executions. The killing had become so normalized that watching fellow human beings die horrible deaths was considered a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound and lasting. Citizens became desensitized to extreme violence through regular exposure to these spectacles. The value of human life, particularly the lives of slaves and foreigners, diminished to the point where people were viewed as expendable entertainment. This callousness towards suffering would influence Roman culture for centuries, creating a society where cruelty was not just accepted, but celebrated. Yet even these arena spectacles weren't the worst punishments Rome had devised. For certain crimes, particularly those that struck at the very foundation of Roman social order, the empire reserved punishments so horrific that they were rarely carried out, serving more as psychological deterrents than actual practices. The worst crime imaginable in Roman society was parricide, the murder of one's parents or close family members. This wasn't just homicide. It was an assault on the sacred bonds that held Roman society together. For such heinous offences, Rome created a punishment that combined drowning with animal torture in ways that pushed the boundaries of human imagination. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack along with several live animals, then thrown into the nearest body of water to drown. But the drowning was only part of the torture. Trapped in the sack with the panicked human would be a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake, each chosen for specific symbolic reasons that reflected Roman beliefs about the nature of parricide. The symbolism was as important as the suffering. The dog represented shamelessness. As Romans believed, dogs had no sense of family loyalty. The monkey symbolized mockery of human nature. The rooster represented unchristian behavior, as these birds were known to fight their own kind. The snake embodied cunning and treachery. Together, these animals would claw, bite, and attack the condemned as all of them struggled desperately in the confined space of the sack. The execution would begin with the victim being bound and forced into the leather sack, while still conscious and aware of what was happening. The animals would be added one by one, each addition increasing the terror and chaos within the confined space. The sack would then be sealed and transported to a bridge or boat, where it would be thrown into deep water. The weight of the animals and the victim would ensure the sack sank quickly, but death wouldn't come immediately. Inside the submerged sack, a nightmare beyond description would unfold. The human victim would struggle for air while being attacked by terrified animals fighting for their own survival. Claws would rake across flesh. Teeth would tear at skin. The snake might bite repeatedly, adding venom to the mixture of terror and drowning. The rooster would use its spurs to inflict deep wounds. The monkey would bite and scratch with desperate fury. The dog would attack anything it could reach in its panic. The condemned would experience drowning, animal attacks, and complete sensory deprivation simultaneously. They would die in absolute darkness, surrounded by the sounds of snarling, screeching animals and their own muffled screams. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical suffering. They would know that their own family members might be watching from the bridge above, witnessing this ultimate punishment for the ultimate crime. This method was so extreme that it was rarely used, but its very existence served as a powerful deterrent. The mere knowledge that such a fate awaited those who killed their parents was enough to reinforce family loyalty throughout the empire. Roman writers would describe the punishment in detail, ensuring that everyone understood exactly what awaited those who contemplated parricide. The logistics of carrying out such executions revealed the methodical nature of Roman cruelty. Executioners had to capture and transport multiple live animals to the execution site. They needed specialized leather workers to create sacks large enough to hold a human and 4 animals while remaining waterproof. They required boats or bridges capable of supporting the weight of the execution party and their gruesome cargo. Every detail had to be planned and coordinated, turning even the most extreme punishments into bureaucratic procedures. These punishments weren't aberrations or exceptions to Roman justice. They were integral parts of a system designed to maintain order through terror. The empire understood that controlling a population numbering in the tens of millions required more than just military force. It required a level of fear so profound that rebellion would seem impossible. By creating punishments that exceeded the worst nightmares of their subjects, Rome ensured that most people would never dare to challenge imperial authority. The psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate victims to their families and communities. Watching a loved one die in such horrific ways would traumatize witnesses for life, creating ripple effects of fear that spread throughout entire populations. Parents would use stories of Roman punishments to control their children. Community leaders would invoke the specter of imperial justice to maintain order. The punishments became cultural touchstones that shaped behavior across the empire. The Romans didn't stop at individual executions or even mass crucifixions. They understood that true control required breaking entire populations, and they developed methods of collective punishment that would make entire cities tremble at the mere mention of Roman displeasure. When rebellions erupted in distant provinces, Rome's response wasn't simply to defeat the rebels. It was to ensure that the very memory of resistance would be burned into the collective consciousness of every surviving witness. Decimation represented one of Rome's most psychologically devastating innovations in military punishment. When entire legions showed cowardice or mutinous behavior, commanders would order every 10th soldier to be beaten to death by his own comrades. But the true genius of this punishment wasn't just the death of 1 in 10 men. It was forcing the survivors to become executioners themselves, using clubs and stones to murder their brothers in arms while looking them in the eyes. The selection process was deliberately random, determined by drawing lots rather than identifying the worst offenders. This randomness created a level of terror that targeted punishment could never achieve. Every soldier knew that his own courage or loyalty meant nothing if fate selected him for death. The innocent would die alongside the guilty, creating an atmosphere where survival depended entirely on the unit's collective behavior. The psychological destruction was methodical and complete. Soldiers would be forced to form circles around their condemned comrades, each man knowing that his own survival required him to participate in murder. The chosen victims would stand in the center, often pleading with friends they had served alongside for years. But mercy meant death for everyone, so the beating would begin. Clubs would rise and fall while grown men wept openly, destroying not just bodies, but souls. The sounds of decimation would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The wet impact of wood against flesh, the screaming that would gradually fade to whimpering and then silence, the sobbing of killers who had just murdered their closest friends. These weren't battles where adrenaline and distance could provide psychological protection. These were intimate killings where every blow was personal and every death was witnessed up close. But Rome's creativity in collective punishment extended far beyond military discipline. When entire cities rebelled, imperial forces would devise retributions that would serve as warnings to every other settlement in the empire. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD provided a template for urban punishment that combined military efficiency with theatrical cruelty on an unprecedented scale. The siege itself became a form of slow-motion execution for an entire population. Roman forces would surround rebellious cities and systematically starve the inhabitants while preventing any escape. Citizens would watch their children waste away from hunger, while Roman soldiers maintained their blockade just outside arrow range. The psychological torture of watching loved ones slowly die while help remained tantalizingly close was as effective as any physical punishment. When cities finally fell, Roman commanders would orchestrate the aftermath like directors staging elaborate theatrical productions. The most beautiful buildings would be systematically demolished while survivors watched. Sacred temples would be desecrated in ways designed to crush not just bodies but spirits. Religious artifacts would be destroyed or stolen, severing the community's connection to their gods and ancestors. The selection of survivors followed carefully planned criteria designed to maximize psychological impact. The youngest and most attractive would be reserved for slavery, ensuring that families would be separated in the most heartbreaking ways possible. Parents would watch their children dragged away in chains, knowing they would likely never see them again. The elderly would often be killed immediately, but not before being forced to witness the destruction of everything they had spent their lives building. Roman engineers would sometimes redirect rivers or demolish walls in ways that would make rebuilding impossible. They understood that physical reconstruction could heal communities, so they would ensure that even the geography itself bore permanent scars of Roman displeasure. Salt would be scattered on agricultural land, poisoning the soil for years to come. Wells would be filled with stones and refuse, denying survivors access to clean water. The documentation of these punishments was as important as the punishments themselves. Roman historians would record every detail of urban destruction, creating written monuments to imperial power that would be copied and distributed throughout the empire. These accounts weren't just historical records. They were propaganda designed to ensure that every provincial governor and city council understood exactly what awaited those who defied Rome. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Roman collective punishment was how it turned survivors into unwilling collaborators in their own oppression. Communities that had witnessed Roman retribution would often become the most zealous supporters of imperial authority, desperate to avoid experiencing such horrors again. They would inform on their neighbors, suppress any hint of dissent, and compete to demonstrate their loyalty to the same power that had destroyed their former lives. The economic dimension of these punishments revealed another layer of Roman calculation. Destroyed cities meant destroyed tax bases, which might seem counterproductive for an empire dependent on provincial revenues. But Rome had learned that the fear generated by occasional spectacular destruction actually increased long-term compliance and productivity. A dozen terrorized cities would generate more revenue than one rebellious province, even accounting for the losses from urban destruction. The Romans also perfected the art of gradual punishment that would slowly crush rebellious spirits without triggering desperate final resistance. Increased taxation would bleed communities dry over time. Forced labor conscription would remove the strongest young men from their families. Religious restrictions would attack cultural identity while maintaining the pretense of tolerance. These slow strangulation techniques often proved more effective than dramatic displays of force. Children born in the aftermath of Roman collective punishments would grow up in societies fundamentally altered by trauma. Parents who had witnessed unthinkable horrors would raise their offspring with an instinctive fear of imperial authority. These children would internalize lessons about the futility of resistance before they were old enough to understand what resistance even meant. The psychological damage would persist for generations, creating populations that were self-policing and instinctively submissive. The religious implications of Roman punishment methods deserve special attention because they reveal how the empire used spiritual terror alongside physical violence. Romans understood that breaking a person's connection to their gods was often more devastating than breaking their bodies. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution. It was a form of spiritual torture that denied victims proper burial rites and left their souls wandering homeless in the afterlife, according to many ancient beliefs. The timing of executions was carefully coordinated with religious calendars to maximize psychological impact. Crucifixions would be scheduled during holy festivals, forcing entire communities to choose between participating in sacred observances and witnessing the destruction of their neighbors. This cruel timing ensured that religious celebrations would forever be associated with memories of suffering and death, Roman authorities would often force condemned criminals to participate in mock religious ceremonies before their executions. Prisoners might be dressed as gods or mythological figures, creating blasphemous parodies of sacred stories. These twisted theatrical productions served multiple purposes, entertaining the crowds while simultaneously mocking the religious beliefs of conquered peoples and demonstrating Roman cultural superiority. The desecration of corpses extended the punishment beyond death itself. Bodies would be left exposed to scavenging animals, denying families the ability to perform proper funeral rites. In cultures where proper burial was essential for spiritual peace, this desecration represented a form of eternal torture that continued long after physical suffering had ended. Parents would be forced to watch their children's remains being torn apart by carrion birds, adding layers of spiritual anguish to their grief. Roman punishment methods also incorporated sophisticated psychological manipulation that would impress modern interrogators. Prisoners would be offered false hopes of reprieve, only to have those hopes crushed at the last moment. They might be told that their families had agreed to ransom them, then forced to watch as those same family members were dragged away in chains. The emotional whiplash of repeated hope and despair would often break spirits more completely than pure physical torture. The social dimension of Roman executions transformed entire communities into unwilling participants in state-sponsored murder. Citizens weren't just allowed to watch punishments unfold, they were actively encouraged to participate through jeering, throwing objects, or even suggesting creative additions to the torture. This mass participation created collective guilt that bound entire populations to the imperial system. Everyone became complicit in the cruelty, making organized resistance psychologically more difficult. The economic incentives surrounding public executions revealed another layer of Roman social engineering. Vendors would set up elaborate marketplaces around execution sites, selling food, drinks, and souvenirs commemorating particularly memorable deaths. Betting pools would form around how long victims might survive, or which animals would prove most effective in arena killings. The commercialization of human suffering transformed murder into a profitable industry that gave citizens economic stakes in continued violence. Professional executioners developed reputations and followings like modern celebrities. Crowds would cheer for their favorite torturers and debate the relative merits of different killing techniques. Some executioners would develop signature methods that became their trademarks, building personal brands around their ability to inflict creative suffering. The most skilled could command premium fees for private executions hosted by wealthy Romans seeking exclusive entertainment. The training required to become a professional executioner involved years of apprenticeship in the systematic study of human anatomy and psychology. These weren't random sadists indulging personal cruelties. They were skilled technicians who understood exactly how to maximize pain while prolonging consciousness. They knew which bones to break to cause the most agony without triggering immediate death. They understood how to position victims to ensure optimal visibility for spectators while maintaining the victim's awareness of their own degradation. The tools of Roman execution were works of engineering artistry that reflected the empire's technological sophistication. Crosses were designed with adjustable components that could be modified for victims of different sizes. Arena mechanisms could flood chambers with water or sand, raise platforms or release animals with precise timing. Even simple instruments like whips were crafted with scientific precision to achieve specific types of tissue damage. The medical knowledge applied to torture reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman punishment methodology. Military physicians would sometimes be present during extended tortures to ensure victims remained conscious and responsive for as long as possible. They would treat wounds that might cause premature death while allowing infections that would increase suffering. This perverse application of healing knowledge to extend agony represents a unique form of medical evil. The documentation systems surrounding Roman punishments were as sophisticated as the punishments themselves. Detailed records were kept of execution methods, victim responses, crowd reactions, and costs. These records served multiple purposes beyond simple bookkeeping. They provided data for improving future punishments, legal precedents for similar cases, and propaganda materials for distribution throughout the empire. The international reputation that Rome cultivated through its punishment methods became a form of diplomatic weapon that could influence foreign policy without requiring military action. Neighboring kingdoms would modify their behavior simply to avoid triggering the kind of retribution they had heard described in gruesome detail. The mere possibility of experiencing Roman justice was often enough to ensure compliance with imperial demands. But perhaps most chilling of all was how completely these extreme punishment methods became normalized within Roman society. What started as exceptional measures for extraordinary crimes gradually became routine procedures for increasingly minor offenses. The threshold for what constituted punishable behavior steadily lowered as citizens became desensitized to extreme violence. Behaviors that might once have merited fines or brief imprisonment began triggering punishments that would destroy entire families. The bureaucratization of cruelty reached levels that would make modern totalitarian states seem amateurish by comparison. Government departments were established specifically to coordinate different aspects of public executions. Specialized roles emerged for animal procurement, crowd management, victim preparation, and cleanup operations. The systematic nature of this cruelty meant that thousands of people built their entire careers around the business of human suffering. The legacy of Roman punishment methods extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries or historical timeframe. The techniques and philosophies developed during centuries of imperial rule would influence legal systems and execution methods for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Medieval and early modern European states would revive Roman practices, sometimes making them even more elaborate and cruel than their ancient predecessors had imagined. The psychological scars left by Roman punishment methods created generational trauma that would reshape entire civilizations in ways we're only beginning to understand today. Children who witnessed these spectacles didn't simply forget what they had seen when they reached adulthood. They carried those images with them, passing down an inherited fear that would influence their descendants for centuries to come. The normalization of extreme violence became so complete that Roman citizens genuinely believed such methods were not just necessary but morally justified. What made Roman punishment culture particularly insidious was how it transformed ordinary people into enthusiastic participants in systematic cruelty. Shopkeepers would close their businesses early to attend executions. Mothers would bring their infants to watch humans being torn apart by wild animals. Teachers would use public tortures as educational opportunities, pointing out anatomical details to their students as condemned prisoners screamed in agony just meters away. The line between civilization and barbarism had been so thoroughly erased that Romans couldn't even recognize it anymore. The economic infrastructure built around human suffering reveals the true depth of Roman moral corruption. Entire industries emerged to support the execution spectacles that had become central to civic life. Specialized craftsmen would design and build increasingly elaborate torture devices. Animal trainers would develop techniques for making wild beasts more aggressive toward human prey. Architects would design amphitheaters with sophisticated drainage systems specifically to handle the massive quantities of blood that would flow during execution days. Private citizens would invest in these industries, like modern stockholders, purchasing shares in gladiatorial schools or exotic animal importation businesses. Wealthy Romans would compete to sponsor the most memorable executions, commissioning custom torture devices or importing rare predators from distant corners of the empire. The suffering of condemned criminals had become a luxury commodity that the rich would purchase to enhance their social status and political influence. The technological innovations developed for torture purposes demonstrate how human creativity can be perverted toward the most horrible ends imaginable. Roman engineers, who might have spent their talents building bridges or aqueducts, instead devoted their skills to designing mechanisms that could inflict precise amounts of pain without causing immediate death. They created adjustable racks that could slowly dislocate joints, heated metal devices that could brand flesh at exact temperatures, and hydraulic systems that could control the flow of water during drowning tortures. These innovations weren't crude instruments of random violence. They were precision tools crafted by skilled artisans who took professional pride in their ability to maximize human suffering. Workshop manuals would be passed down from master torturer to apprentice, documenting the most effective techniques for breaking bones, tearing flesh, and destroying spirits. The knowledge accumulated over generations of experimentation on living human beings, creating a scientific approach to cruelty that rivaled any other Roman technical achievement. The religious perversion inherent in Roman punishment methods added layers of spiritual torment that pure physical torture could never achieve. Condemned criminals would often be forced to participate in mock religious ceremonies before their executions, dressed as gods or mythological figures in elaborate costumes that would soon be soaked with their blood. These blasphemous performances served multiple purposes, entertaining the crowds while simultaneously destroying the victims' connections to their spiritual beliefs and cultural identities. The horrific reality of Roman punishment reveals a civilization that achieved unprecedented heights of engineering, law, and governance, while simultaneously descending to depths of cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. These weren't isolated acts of violence committed by madmen or sadists. They were systematic methods of control implemented by one of history's most sophisticated societies, demonstrating how easily the line between civilization and barbarism can be crossed when power becomes the ultimate value. The Romans didn't just execute criminals or suppress rebellions. They transformed human suffering into a pillar of their entire social and political system, creating a culture where witnessing extreme violence became as normal as attending religious festivals or commercial markets. The true horror lies not just in the methods themselves, but in how completely they were embraced by ordinary citizens who saw nothing wrong with bringing their families to watch fellow human beings tortured to death for entertainment. Today, as we examine these dark chapters of human history, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for cruelty that exists within any society. The Romans weren't monsters from some distant primitive age. They were people much like ourselves, with families, hopes, dreams, and daily concerns. Yet they created and participated in systems of violence that surpass anything we might encounter in our worst nightmares. Understanding Roman punishment methods isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity. It's a warning about how quickly civilized societies can lose their way when fear becomes the primary tool of governance and when the suffering of others becomes normalized entertainment. The screams that once echoed through the Roman Forum have long since faded into silence, but the lessons they carry about human nature and the fragility of compassion remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago.